The heat was a physical thing, a solid wall that pressed in from all sides, thick with the smell of dust, hot iron, and stale despair. May stood on the splintered boards of the station platform, the wood scorching the soles of her bare feet, a punishment she accepted with the same stoicism she applied to the sun that beat down on her dark hair. Her world had shrunk to this single point of torment, a town called Redemption, a name so steeped in irony it felt like a cruel joke whispered by the wind that offered no relief, only a fresh scouring of grit against her skin. She wore the only clothes she owned, a pair of loose-fitting trousers and a tunic, the fabric thin and colorless from 1,000 washings, a stark contrast to the stiff corsets and layered skirts of the few women who scurried past, their faces pinched with disapproval as they eyed her. She was a ghost here, an apparition from a world they could not comprehend, and their gazes were like stones, heavy and sharp. Her instructions had been simple, delivered by a man with a stained waistcoat and teeth like yellowed corn kernels. Wait on the platform. Mr. Miller will collect you. He's paid for a strong back for his farm. The man, Silas Stone, had not looked at her when he spoke, his eyes fixed on the silver dollars in his palm. He had spoken of her as one might speak of a new mule or a sack of grain, property, a commodity. May had learned long ago that to survive, she had to become what they saw, at least on the surface. A blank slate, a quiet vessel, her true self hidden so deep it was a pearl in the gut of an oyster, safe from the prying knives of the world. So she waited, her small bundle of possessions clutched in one hand, her posture still, her eyes downcast but missing nothing. She saw the way the saloon doors swung open to vomit out men stinking of whiskey and sweat, the tired slump of the horses at the hitching post, the brittle, sun-bleached bones of some forgotten animal lying in the dust of the main street. Everything here was dying, or already dead. Hours bled into one another, measured by the slow, relentless crawl of shadows across the dirt. The sun began its slow descent, painting the bruised sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Mr. Miller did not come. A cold knot of fear, a familiar companion, tightened in her stomach. What happened to a girl like her when the buyer did not arrive? She knew the answer. She would fall back into the hands of men like Silas Stone, and the next transaction might not be for a strong back. The thought was a shard of ice in the furnace of the day. She pushed it down, locking it away with all the other fears. She would not cry. She would not show weakness. She would simply wait, because waiting was all she had left. The platform emptied, the last of the day's travelers disappearing into the town's dusty maw. The world grew quiet, the only sounds the creak of a distant sign and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. It was in this encroaching silence that she finally saw him. He did not ride into town with any fanfare. He simply materialized out of the shimmering haze, a lone rider on a big, dark horse. He was not the Mr. Miller she had been told to expect, some portly farmer with soft hands. This man was carved from the land itself, all harsh angles and weathered lines. He was tall and lean, his shoulders broad under a faded chambray shirt. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the grim set of his mouth and a beard that was more dust than color. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, as if conserving energy was a matter of life and death. He dismounted in front of the general store, his boots sinking into the deep dust without a sound. He did not look her way. He was not looking for a person at all. His eyes scanned the street as if searching for a misplaced tool or a stray animal. Jedediah Thorne had come to town for a farmhand, a boy named Miller, whose father had died, leaving the lad to make his own way. He'd sent a letter and the money to Silas Stone, the closest thing Redemption had to an agent for labor. Stone was a grubby little man, but he got things done. Jedediah needed the help. The loneliness of his homestead was a living thing, a weight that settled heavier with each passing year, but it was the work that was grinding him down. Fences needed mending, the well needed deepening, and the coming winter demanded a woodpile twice the size of the one he had. He pushed his hat back, wiping a sleeve across his brow, and his gaze finally fell upon the small figure at the end of the empty station platform. A girl, a Chinese girl, barefoot, and still as a stone carving. A cold spike of anger shot through him. He turned and strode toward Stone's office, his long legs eating up the ground, his spurs kicking up angry puffs of dust. The confrontation was short, and ugly. Stone, sweating in his small, fly-blown office, spread his hands in a gesture of greasy supplication. The Miller boy took sick, Jedediah. A fever. This was all I could get on short notice. She's a worker, I'm told, from the railroad camps. They work 'em hard. He avoided Jedediah's eyes, shuffling papers on his desk. I paid for a farmhand, a boy who can swing an axe and handle a team. Not that. Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. He gestured vaguely toward the station. She's yours now. Bill of sale is right here. Stone slid a piece of paper across the desk. No refunds. Jedediah stared at the paper, the looping script a testament to a transaction he had not agreed to. He saw the trap. He could leave her. He could walk away and let Stone do whatever he pleased with the girl. But the thought left a taste like ash in his mouth. He remembered his wife, Sarah, her quiet strength and the fierce decency that had been the bedrock of their life together. She would not have stood for this. He snatched the paper from the desk, the crinkle of it loud in the tense silence. Without another word, he turned and left, the bill of sale clutched in his fist, a document that felt more like a condemnation than a contract. He walked back toward the platform, his mind a maelstrom of frustration and a reluctant, burdensome sense of duty. He stopped a few feet from her, a chasm of culture and circumstance separating them. She finally lifted her head, and for the first time he saw her eyes. They were not filled with the fear or pleading he had expected. They were dark and deep and held a weary, ancient intelligence. She was watching him, evaluating him. It was unsettling. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. I am Jedediah Thorne. He held out the crumpled paper as if it were an explanation. She glanced at it, but did not take it. Her gaze remained on his face. He was at a loss. He had not exchanged more than a handful of words with a woman since Sarah's passing 5 years ago. He gestured awkwardly toward his horse. We're leaving. The first complication arose immediately. There was only one horse. He had expected the Miller boy to have his own mount, or be strong enough to keep pace on foot for the long journey. He looked at the girl's bare feet, already red and blistered from the platform boards. Walking was not an option. A fresh wave of irritation washed over him. Every part of this was wrong. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. You'll have to ride behind me. He expected protest, tears, some display of feminine frailty. He received none. She simply nodded once, her expression unreadable. This was her first test, though she did not know it. Her life had been a series of such tests, of accepting the unacceptable, of bending so as not to break. She saw the challenge in his posture, the impatience in the set of his jaw. To refuse would be to confirm his assessment of her as a useless burden. To acquiesce was to place her life completely in the hands of this grim, silent stranger. But there was no real choice. She walked to the horse, which stood patiently, its hide twitching at flies. The animal was huge, its back a mountain she could not possibly scale. Jedediah watched her for a moment, his jaw tight, before he let out another frustrated sigh. He cupped his hands together. Step here. His voice was gruff, devoid of any kindness, a simple mechanical instruction. She placed her foot in his calloused hands, and he lifted her with an easy strength that stole her breath. She scrambled onto the horse's rump, settling behind the worn leather of the saddle. He swung himself up in front of her, the movement fluid and practiced. Without a word, he nudged the horse forward, and they left the squalor of redemption behind. The departure from town was a release. The oppressive clutter of buildings and the stench of humanity fell away, replaced by the immense, soul-shaking silence of the plains. The world opened up, a vast canvas of pale grass and endless sky. The sun hammered down, and the heat rising from the ground created shimmering mirages in the distance, making the horizon dance and tremble. For May, the sheer scale of it was terrifying. In her homeland, the world was intimate, carved into terraced hillsides and crowded villages. This land was a void, an emptiness that threatened to swallow a person whole. It felt like the surface of the moon, alien and indifferent to the small, crawling lives upon it. The landscape was a reflection of the man in front of her, vast, silent, and unyielding. She held on to the back of his saddle, her knuckles white, careful not to touch him. With every step the horse took, she felt the solid wall of his back, the tension in his muscles. He rode with a straight-backed vigilance, his head constantly moving, his eyes scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land. He was a part of this place, as weathered and enduring as the rock formations that broke the monotony of the plains. May focused on the rhythm of the horse's gait, the creak of the leather, the soft thud of hooves on the dry earth. These small, real sounds were an anchor in the overwhelming emptiness. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but to better feel the movement of the horse, to feel the heat on her skin, to exist only in the present moment. This was a survival technique she had perfected long ago. Do not think of yesterday. Do not dream of tomorrow. Simply endure today. Jedediah was acutely aware of the small, silent presence behind him. He had expected her to be a chattering nuisance or a weeping burden. Instead, there was only silence. He could feel her stillness, a strange centered calm that was at odds with her apparent fragility. He had braced himself for complaints about the heat, the dust, the discomfort of the ride. There were none. He found himself listening for the slightest sound from her, a sigh, a shift in weight, anything. But she was as quiet as a shadow. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Who was this girl? Where did she come from that she could face this brutal landscape with such placid endurance? He pushed the thoughts away. It didn't matter. She was a problem he had not asked for, a complication in a life he had deliberately stripped of all complications. He would get her to his homestead, give her a place to stay through the winter, as decency demanded, and in the spring, he would see her back to town. That was the plan. Simple, clean. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow, cruel descent. The world was bleached of color, reduced to shades of brown and beige. Jedediah's own throat was raw with thirst, and he knew she must be suffering. He spotted a thin green line in the distance, the telltale sign of a creek bed, likely almost dry this time of year but with a chance of pooled water. He guided the horse toward it, the animal's pace quickening as it smelled the moisture in the air. He dismounted in the shade of a lone, scraggly cottonwood tree and turned to help her down. She slid off the horse before he could reach her, her movement stiff but sure. She stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flash of pain cross her face before the mask of neutrality slipped back into place. He unhooked the waterskin from his saddle. It was a gesture he had performed 1,000 times, but this time it felt different. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her small frame. He held it out. She looked at the skin, then at his face, her dark eyes searching for something. He did not know what she was looking for, but he held his ground, his arm outstretched. It was more than just an offer of water. In this parched, unforgiving land, water was life. To offer it first was an acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that transcended language. After a long moment, she reached out with both hands and took the skin. She drank sparingly, a few small sips, before wiping her mouth with the back of her hand and offering it back to him. He took it and drank, the lukewarm water a balm to his scorched throat. He looked at her, standing in the shade of the tree, and for the first time, he saw not a burden, but a person. A small, silent, and impossibly resilient person. The silence that stretched between them now felt less like a void and more like a shared space. They arrived as twilight was bleeding the last of the color from the sky, turning the world to shades of gray and deep indigo. The homestead was not much more than a dark shape against the horizon, a small solitary cabin, with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. To Jedediah, it was home, a sanctuary he had carved out of the wilderness with his own two hands. To May, seeing it for the first time, it looked like the loneliest place in the world. A profound wave of desolation washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This was her new cage, a tiny speck of human endeavor in an ocean of raw, untamed nature. Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, sank like a stone. She kept her face impassive, her gaze fixed on the cabin as they drew closer. Jedediah dismounted and led the horse to a small corral next to the main cabin. He worked with an efficient, practiced grace, unsaddling the animal and rubbing it down. Me stood where he had left her, a solitary figure in the deepening gloom. She expected him to gesture her toward the main house, to the place where he lived. The thought filled her with a quiet dread. But he did not. After tending to the horse, he picked up a lantern from the porch, lit it, and walked past her toward a smaller secondary structure a short distance from the main cabin. It was a simple, rough-hewn building, little more than a shed, that he had once used as a line shack when he ran more cattle. He stopped at the door and turned to her, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. He pushed the door open. It did not lead into darkness. A small fire was already crackling in a tiny stone hearth, its warm light pushing back the chill of the coming night. He had ridden ahead at some point, she realized, to prepare this. He gestured for her to enter. She stepped cautiously over the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was tiny, but it was clean. A narrow cot with a neatly folded wool blanket sat against one wall. On a small crate beside it was a tin plate with a piece of cornbread, some jerky, and a bucket filled with fresh, clear water. He had provided for her, but it was the door that made her breath catch in her throat. He pointed to it, his finger jabbing the air. On the inside of the rough plank door was a new, heavy wooden bolt. He had installed it for her. It was a lock she could control. This single act was a language more powerful than any words he could have spoken. He was not her captor. He was not a threat. He was offering her a sanctuary, a space that was hers alone, a place where she could be safe from him. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected honor that it completely disarmed her. It was a promise. He looked at her one last time, his face shadowed and unreadable in the flickering light. He gave a short, curt nod, then pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the warmth. She stood for a long moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding, the crackle of the fire, the vast silence of the night outside. Then she slid the heavy bolt into place. The solid, woody sound of it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sliver of something that felt dangerously like hope. The day settled into a rhythm, as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Each morning, just before dawn, May would find a small pail of goat's milk, and sometimes a fresh egg left on the stump outside her door. She never saw him leave it. He was a ghost in the pre-dawn light, a silent provider who asked for nothing in return. From the small window of her cabin, she watched him. His life was a testament to relentless labor. He moved from sunup to sundown, a solitary figure locked in an endless battle with the land. He mended fences, his movements patient and precise. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in the vast silence. He worked his small vegetable garden, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he tended the struggling plants. He was a machine of survival, fueled by a purpose she could not yet understand. Her initial fear of him slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep and analytical curiosity. She began to see the man beneath the harsh exterior. She saw the way he spoke to his horse, his voice a low, gentle murmur that was a stark contrast to his usual grating silence. She saw him pause in his work sometimes, his gaze fixed on a small, overgrown plot of land near the main cabin, marked by two simple wooden crosses. In those moments, the iron mask of his composure would slip, and she would see a flash of such profound and bottomless grief on his face that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. He was not just a hard man, he was a haunted one. He was a prisoner here, just as she was, chained not by a bill of sale, but by a memory. Her perception of him shifted. He was no longer her captor, but a fellow inmate in a prison of solitude. Within the small confines of her cabin, May began to reclaim a piece of herself. The space became her own. She swept the floorboards clean each day and kept her meager belongings in a neat, ordered pile. She began to take short walks, never straying far, collecting things that caught her eye: a strangely shaped stone, a fallen feather from a hawk, a twisted piece of sagebrush. She had no tools, but she found a sharp-edged piece of flint down by the creek bed. In the quiet evenings, by the light of her small fire, she began to carve. She took scraps of firewood and began to shape them. Her hands, which had been taught the delicate art of calligraphy and embroidery in a life that felt like it belonged to another person, found a new purpose. She carved the things she saw: the hawk that circled overhead, the gaunt shape of the cottonwood tree, the patient profile of Jedediah's horse. It was an act of quiet defiance, a way of imposing her own order and beauty onto this harsh, barren world. It was how she reminded herself that she was more than just a survivor. She was a creator. One morning, after she collected the milk pail, she left something in its place on the stump. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was a risk, a deliberate breach of their unspoken contract of non-interaction. It was not a payment for her keep. She knew he would be insulted by that. It was a message. It said, I am here. I see. I exist. She watched from her window as he approached the stump. He stopped, his gaze falling on the small wooden bird. He stood motionless for a long time, looking at it. Then, he gently picked it up, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate as he turned it over and over, examining the fine details. He did not look toward her cabin. He simply pocketed the carving and walked away. The next morning, next to the milk pail, was a small worn whittling knife and a smooth, clean block of pine. The unspoken conversation continued. She would leave a new carving every few days: a running wolf, a coiled snake, a sleeping fox. He never acknowledged them directly, but sometimes he would leave a better piece of wood or a small file for sharpening her knife. It was their language, a silent dialogue conducted through offerings on a weathered tree stump. It was a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of their two separate worlds. One evening, a few weeks after her arrival, she saw him walk out from his cabin as the sun was setting. In his hand was a piece of paper. She recognized it instantly, the bill of sale from Silas Stone. He walked to the center of the yard, struck a match against his boot, and set the corner of the paper alight. He held it as it burned, the flames consuming the hateful script, turning the document of her bondage into a black, curling ash. He held it until the fire licked at his fingertips. Then he opened his hand and let the ashes scatter on the wind. He stood there for a moment, his silhouette a stark, lonely figure against the dying embers of the day. He looked toward her cabin, his gaze steady and direct. She knew this was another message, the most important one yet. The following day, he broke his long silence. He was waiting for her when she opened her door in the morning. He stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, a gesture of deference that stunned her. His voice, when he spoke, was rusty from disuse, but clear. The paper is gone. He paused as if searching for the right words. You are not my property. You never were. You are free. He looked out toward the distant mountains, their peaks already dusted with the first hint of snow. Winter is coming. It's a hard journey to any town from here. You are welcome to stay until the spring thaw. The choice is yours. He looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time she saw not a hint of anger or resentment, only a quiet, weary sincerity. He had given her back her name, her personhood, her freedom, and in doing so, he had bound her to him more tightly than any contract ever could. She simply nodded, and he seemed to understand. He put his hat back on and walked away, back to his work, the matter settled. Her staying was now her own decision. The fragile peace of their silent coexistence was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. It was late afternoon, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Jedediah was splitting logs, the rhythmic crack of the wood a familiar comfort, when he heard it. He froze, his axe held mid-swing, his head cocked, listening. It was more than one rider, and they were moving fast. A cold knot of dread formed in his gut. Visitors were rare to the point of non-existence, and they were never good news. He looked toward May's cabin. She was already standing in the doorway, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the plume of dust rising from the east. She had heard it too. Silas Stone was in the lead, his face flushed with a mixture of greed and cheap whiskey. Behind him were three other men, hard-faced riders with rifles resting easy in the crooks of their arms. They looked like the kind of men the railroad hired to clear out squatters, ruthless, efficient, and devoid of conscience. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, their presence an ugly stain on the landscape. Thorne! Stone's voice was slick with false bonhomie. Just came to correct a business error. There's been a new offer for the girl, a much better one. I'm here to collect my property. Jedediah slowly lowered his axe, planting it firmly in the chopping block. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements calm and deliberate, belying the cold fury coiling inside him. She's not your property, Stone. She's a free woman. Stone laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. A bill of sale says otherwise. I'm taking her back, one way or another. He nodded to the men with him, and they began to dismount, fanning out, their intentions brutally clear. Get inside, Jedediah said, his voice a low command directed at May without looking at her. Bolt the door. He began to walk slowly backward toward his own cabin, his eyes never leaving the advancing men. He knew what this was. It wasn't about the girl, not really. It was about power. Stone could not abide the idea that a man like Jedediah had defied him. He reached the porch of his cabin just as May slipped inside her own. He heard the solid thud of her bolt sliding home. He backed into his own cabin, grabbing the heavy rifle that was always kept loaded by the door. The siege had begun. The world shrank to the confines of the small cabin. The vast plains disappeared, replaced by the narrow view from the two small windows. The gunmen took cover behind the woodpile and the corral, their positions chosen with professional competence. The first shot splintered the wood of the window frame, sending a spray of sharp fragments into the room. Jedediah returned fire, his shot careful and measured, forcing the man to duck back behind cover. They were pinned. He was a good shot, and he knew his land, but he was one man against four. The math was simple and grim. He was reloading when he heard a frantic scratching at his back door. His blood ran cold. It had to be one of them, trying to break in. He swung the rifle around, his finger tightening on the trigger, just as the door was pushed open. It was May. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a focused intensity he had never seen before. She slipped inside and bolted the door behind her, her movements quick and silent. They will set my cabin on fire, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of his own hammering heart. Force us out. She was right. It was the logical next step. They were now trapped in the same small space, the flimsy pretense of their separate lives burned away by the encroaching violence. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The battle raged. The gunman laid down a steady, suppressing fire, pinning Jedediah to the front window. He heard a shout from the side of the house and knew they were making their move, trying to flank him, to get to the back door or the other window. He was trapped, unable to cover both angles at once. A rifle barrel appeared at the edge of the side window. He had no shot. A man was about to get a clear line of sight into the room. He braced himself for the impact. The shot, when it came, was not from outside. It was a deafening crack from inside the cabin itself. Jedediah flinched, his ears ringing, and looked over in stunned disbelief. May was at the side window. She held his old hunting rifle, a heavy, long-barreled weapon he hadn't used in years. It was almost as tall as she was. She had it braced against the window frame, her small body absorbing the powerful recoil without flinching. Her cheek was pressed to the stock, one eye squinted shut, the other sighting down the barrel with an unnerving professional calm. Outside, the man who had been at the window let out a strangled cry and crumpled to the ground. She worked the bolt action with a smooth, practiced efficiency, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. She looked at Jedediah, her dark eyes blazing with a fire he had never imagined. The woodpile, she said, her voice sharp and clear. It was not a suggestion. It was a tactical command. He understood immediately. He moved to the front window as she covered the side. They were no longer a man and his ward, they were a team. A silent, nonverbal communication passed between them. He would draw their fire while she picked them off. He fired two quick shots toward the corral, and as expected, two of the men returned fire, their attention fixed on him. In that moment of distraction, another shot cracked from May's window, another cry, another man down. The fight was brutal and short. Silas Stone, seeing his hired help dispatched with such shocking efficiency, made a desperate, cowardly run for the horses. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, his rifle leveled. "Stone!" His voice boomed across the yard, stopping the man in his tracks. Stone turned slowly, his hands raised, his face a mask of terror. Jedediah fired, not at Stone, but at the ground near his feet, sending the man stumbling backward in panic. He fired again, splintering the saddle horn on the nearest horse. The remaining animals, spooked by the gunfire, bolted, galloping away across the plains. Jedediah lowered his rifle. He would not kill the man. Killing him would be an ending, but leaving him alive, stranded, and on foot was a punishment that fit the land. Stone was left to the mercy of the wilderness, a fate far crueler than a quick bullet. The silence that descended in the aftermath was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was filled with the smell of blood and spent powder, the sight of the dead men lying twisted in the dust. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a shaky, raw-nerved vulnerability. Jedediah walked back into the cabin. May was still standing by the window, the heavy rifle held loosely in her hands. She was staring out at the carnage, her face as still and pale as porcelain. The wall between them, the carefully constructed barrier of silence and separation, had been completely and irrevocably shattered. He gently took the rifle from her hands. Her fingers were cold. He looked from the weapon to her face, a thousand questions in his eyes. She finally looked at him, and he saw the carefully constructed walls of her own composure beginning to crumble. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, before he gently wiped it away with his thumb. It was the first time he had ever touched her. In the quiet of the blood-soaked cabin, with the dead lying outside their door, the shared violence had forged a new and unbreakable intimacy. He led her to a chair and pushed her gently into it. He knelt before her, taking her small, cold hands in his own large, warm ones. And in the hushed quiet of the room, he began to speak, the words coming in a slow, halting rush, a confession 5 years in the making. My wife, he started, his voice a raw whisper. Her name was Sarah. My boy was named Daniel. He stared at their joined hands, not at her face. We built this place together, carved it right out of nothing. We were happy. He paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. Then the fever came. It took them both in the same week. I buried them out there, on that hill. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were swimming with a grief so raw it was like an open wound. I've been alone ever since. The silence, it gets so loud sometimes. I thought I was dead too, just a body that kept working. He looked at her, at the girl who had just fought and killed beside him, who had shown a strength he could barely comprehend. I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you're not a ghost. You're the first real thing that's been in this house since they left. The world outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The immediate violent threat was gone, but the landscape of their relationship had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The silence that returned was not the empty, desolate silence of before. It was a shared quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of what they had just endured together. The air was still thick with the metallic tang of blood, but beneath it, something new was taking root. The brutal crucible of the fight had burned away all pretense, all distance, leaving only two survivors in a quiet, isolated world of their own making. May did not return to her small cabin. The thought never even occurred to either of them. The separate spaces they had maintained were a relic of a former life, a time before shared gunfire and spilled blood. While Jedediah dealt with the grim necessity of dragging the bodies away from the homestead, she began to move. She fetched water, her movements slow and deliberate at first, then gaining a steady purpose. She tore strips from a clean shirt to serve as bandages for the graze on his arm and the cut on her own cheek from a flying splinter. She found a small store of potatoes and onions and began to prepare a meal. The simple domestic act a powerful anchor in the chaotic aftermath. The small cabin was no longer her sanctuary. This house, the one she had just defended as fiercely as he had, was now the center of their shared world. Her move was not a conscious decision, but an organic, inevitable shift. Their two separate lives had bled into one another and could no longer be disentangled. A new language began to form between them, one built not on words, but on shared tasks and comfortable proximity. In the days that followed, he showed her how to set snares for rabbits, his large hands guiding her small ones, as he demonstrated how to tie the intricate knots. He taught her how to read the clouds, to know when a storm was coming from the west, to understand the subtle shifts in the wind. She, in turn, brought a quiet order to the chaotic bachelorhood of his home. She mended his worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. She learned to bake a dense, hearty bread in his small oven, filling the cabin with a smell that chased away the lingering ghosts of solitude and gunpowder. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. He would chop wood, and she would stack it. He would milk the goat, and she would churn the butter. Their partnership, forged in violence, was now tempered in the gentle rhythms of daily survival. The carvings continued, but she no longer left them on the stump. She placed them on the mantelpiece above the hearth, a growing collection of small wooden creatures that brought a flicker of life to the Spartan room. He would pick them up in the evenings, turning them over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. He never praised them with words, but one day he came back from the creek bed with a piece of beautifully grained cottonwood root, its shape complex and challenging, and left it by her chair without comment. It was his way of saying, I see you. I value what you do. One evening, weeks after the fight, they sat by the fire. The first snow of winter had begun to fall, soft, silent flakes that blanketed the world in white and sealed them into their isolation. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside. May was polishing the stock of the old hunting rifle, her touch gentle and respectful. Jedediah was watching her, his face illuminated by the firelight. The harsh lines seemed to have softened, the deep etched grief in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful, not the rusty, grating sound it had once been, but a smooth, warm rumble. The house was always quiet before, he said, his gaze on the fire. After they were gone, I thought the quiet was a mercy, a way to forget. He looked over at her then, at her dark hair catching the firelight, at the focused, serene expression on her face as she worked. A small, sad smile touched his lips. I was wrong. It wasn't quiet. It was empty. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to indicate the space around them, the small, warm room filled with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. I had forgotten what a home sounded like. It was not a declaration of love in the way the world understood it. It was something deeper, quieter, and more profound. It was an admission of need, an acknowledgement of her presence not as a helper or a partner in survival, but as the very heart of this new life they had built together from the ashes of their old ones. She looked up from the rifle, her dark eyes meeting his, and in that shared glance, everything was understood. The barefoot girl who had arrived on a scorching platform, a piece of property on a bill of sale, had endured the fire and the silence. She had fought for her place in this harsh, beautiful land, and in doing so, had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. She had never left, because there was nowhere else in the world to go. She was already where she belonged.